Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. If you're in Hong Kong, it's afternoon. So let's um let's talk. Let's talk the thing. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about Mahdia. Who wanna talk about Mahdia? Let's talk about Mahdia, because Mahdia needs to be spoken about. And look at it, the language has switched up on my computer. It's not English, it's something else. It looks like a Middle Eastern language. The closed captioning has been streamed. But Mahdia, Mahdia is an avoidable tragedy. So there are lots of information that has come out, and of course there've been lots of paternalism as well, in terms of how the central government has responded to this situation. Um, and the government also wants to censor how people speak about Mahdia, and because of course social media social media allows people now to have an opinion and state that opinion without having to rely on the traditional forms of media. So you don't have to rely on news source or the Chronicle or NCN or DPI to get across your message. You can do exactly what I'm doing right now. Um, and Charlotte Wong says, I can't get over it. It's so sad. I hope all public buildings will have adequate fire extinguishers, especially the schools and dorms. I'm depressed about it. I could not even function. I could not even function for a few days because of the situation. I simply could not function. I mean, it's what happened. What happened in Mahdia should have been it's unavoidable. And the unfortunate reality is there'll be two fall people, right? There'll be the teenage girl who apparently or allegedly lit the started the fire, and there'll be the dorm mother. So apparently the file has been sent to the DPP, and you could expect they've been held already more than 72 hours, right? They've been held for or today actually maybe 72 hours. So you can expect that the DPP will announce today that charges will be laid. But I mean, you have to look at this. I mean, you have to look at the whole social condition of humanity. You have to take a holistic look at what happened here, right? You have 60 girls living in a dormitory, right? 60 girls living in a dormitory, living in it's almost like a shelter. right? It's a one-story building, and a whole bunch of bunk beds, in that dormitory, and there's no privacy for the girls, for those teenage girls. They're far away from home. Um, the 25 windows that are at the place where they live, they're all shuttered, right? That's what the fire department said in its report, that the 25 windows were heavily grilled. And I posted the fire department's report on my Facebook page, because even the fire department report is simply ridiculous. This is what the fire department report said. It says, based on preliminary investigations, it was revealed that the fire that ravaged Mahdia Secondary School female dormitory was maliciously set by a person or persons unknown. Well, we know that the person who allegedly set the fire is indeed known, not unknown. Physical examination and investigation indicates that the point of origin of the fire was in the southwestern interior of the building, in the laboratory area. It was also observed that 26 windows of the building were heavily grilled, and the 5 doors were locked with keys. You're talking about a Georgetown prison situation. You know, I did the prison inquiry when the strong wing of the prison was burnt in 2016, and the doors were locked, the windows were heavily grilled. There was confusion finding the keys to unlock the prison. There was a prison officer who performed human service, Mr. Lykin, that got the door open after some effort, but 18 prisoners died in that fire, and here you have 19 school children died. And then the fire service went on to say at approximately 22:15 hours on May 21st, 2023, a civilian ran into the Mahdia fire station and alerted the ranks of the building that the building was on fire at the dormitory site. So it seems like there was no fire monitoring, no monitoring by the fire department of that building, nor were there fire alarms, nor smoke detectors, or anything like that. This is what they said. They said all-terrain vehicle number 1 and a crew under the command of Sub-Officer Scott immediately responded to the 111-mile Patara Road Region 8 location. When the fire department arrived on the scene, it was observed that the one flat wooden and concrete building was engulfed in flames. The female dormitory housed 59 students. At the time the fire occurred, there were 56 females in the dormitory and a 5-year-old boy. Quick action resulted in the ranks saving the lives of 19 students who were trapped in the building. This was managed by breaking holes in the northeastern wall of the dorm. After the fire was extinguished, it was discovered that 19 children perished, including the 5-year-old boy. The 38 students that were rescued had suffered injuries, some life-threatening. 6 students who were severely injured were air dashed to Georgetown for treatment, while 32 remained in Mahdia to receive treatment and undergo observations. However, several of the students were transferred to Georgetown for further treatment. I mean, that's the fire department version of events, and certainly the fire department of the joint services has not. The fire department haven't explained when was the last fire inspection, when was the last fire drill conducted, when was the last fire prevention seminar that was conducted for these students. They haven't said, you know, who authorized the grilling of those windows in the way they were, who authorized the locking of the 5 doors with keys. So I mean, what you have here is you have Indigenous, First Nations, Aboriginal students held in prisoner-like conditions. It doesn't matter what spin the government of Guyana puts on this situation. It doesn't matter what spin they put on it. It leaves a terrible blotch on that country and how it treats children, especially children from the most marginalized group. Right? It leaves a indelible blotch, because you know it's a residential school, really. It's a residential school for Aboriginal kids who do not have access to education in their communities. So it is meant to provide a space for them to get education, and this is the excuse they're saying. So they're saying that the place was locked because the teenage girls leave the dorm so that they could go and hook up with men. Just nonsense. It's like scandalous. It's like scandalous for them to say, okay, we put them in a death trap because we want to prevent them from hooking up with men or from going out and consuming alcohol or consuming illegal substances, drugs, right? You know, that's the spin. That's the spin that is being peddled, because Rafi asked me, well, what's the spin? Well, that's the spin, right? You know, and somebody somebody is upset because the teenage girl who is the accused was taken for evaluation. Well, of course she has to be taken for evaluation to ascertain whether she whether she has any mental health issues or what her level of fitness is or competence is. Right? But the question is really fundamental. You have windows heavily grilled. You have doors that are locked and require keys. You don't have an escape plan in the event there's a fire or some emergency at nights so that the kids can safely escape. So you gotta ask yourself, was this a school that these kids were in? Or was it a prison? What was it? And the government of Guyana have to account for it. The government of Guyana has to account for it. In any other country, the Minister of Education would have had to resign. Priya, your time is up. Resign. Resign. Ministerial responsibility rests with you. You hear me, Priya? Ministerial responsibility rests with you, and I want people to tag you on this live, and I want you to hear me. You should resign. So the entire cabinet, well, not the entire cabinet. Jack Joe hasn't been there, nor Anil, and a few of them. They haven't gone up there. Um, but most of the cabinet have been up there. You know. Um, I mean, the saying is they're saying that the dorm mother couldn't find the keys and she was confused and this and that. They've got to launch a thorough inquiry into that. It's quite inexplicable that all those lives would have been lost if the dorm mother was immediately on the scene, or if there were measures in place to rescue the kids. She wasn't at that building. She had to be somewhere else. Interestingly enough, the fire department report has no timelines. It has no timelines. All it has is that at 22:15 hours, a civilian ran into the Mahdia fire station and alerted the ranks that the building was on fire. It doesn't say how long the ATV took to get to the location. It doesn't say what time a fire tender was summoned to attend the location. It doesn't say what time efforts were made to rescue the students who were trapped in the building. It doesn't say what life-preserving equipment was taken to the scene. It says nothing. Not a single thing that makes sense. Right? None of that. I'm perplexed that in the circumstances here, there was not even a jaws of life. The jaws of life could cut open the steel grills. There was none of that. There wasn't jaws of life. There wasn't anything to smash open the building. And a lot of answers are needed. A lot of answers are needed. The fire department report is quite weak, is quite wishy-washy. We need answers. The president of Guyana today spoke about social media being a powerful tool and that people should desist from commenting on the fire and on the situation. And no, Ravi says, well, in all fairness, we have to give the president his jacket for his response. No, we don't have to give the president his jacket for the response. I mean, that wasn't proactive. That was reactive to a tragedy. That was reactive to a tragedy that has international significance. As you saw, the coverage of the fire in Mahdia was all over the world. It generated coverage, from Al Jazeera to BBC to Washington Post to the New York Times to CBC here in Canada to the Globe and Mail. All these news coverage, New York Post, even the South China Morning Post, ABC. So it's coverage that was international in scope because it's one of the worst. It's one of the worst school fires in history. It's one of the worst school fires in history. So, um, yeah, I have no doubt that the president was on the ground. That the president, he showed up at Eugene Correa Airport to sort of oversee the operation. But I think you have to bear in mind that there were situations in Guyana that should have provide lessons so that this would not have occurred. The Georgetown Prison fire alone is would have been an important lesson that when the fire department is responding to a fire at a school where students are housed and trapped, because I'm sure that the civilian told them that the students are trapped in there. Right? The fire department is responding, but the entire joint services should have in the area should have been activated. Yeah, well, Philbert, you're right, and it is going to be an international human rights response. I mean, human rights and indigenous rights activists from around the world now are going to pay attention to Guyana and how indigenous people are treated. But we have to be quite frank that the response of the Guyana Fire Service was subpar. It was suboptimal. How do you show up to a fire like that without rescue equipment or without proper equipment? And you heard from the live videos, firemen were cursing and swearing because they were frustrated because they didn't have the necessary equipment to launch rescues of those children. So the fire department officials as well were frustrated. Were frustrated with their own ineffectiveness. I mean, okay, the student lit a fire, right? You have 60 students in there. It appear apparent, but we have to get a comprehensive report. But it seemed apparent that the school wasn't equipped with fire alarms. It doesn't seem like fire extinguishers were present. It doesn't seem there were any fire exits because they had to smash through the walls to get the students out. So there were no fire exits. If there were fire exits, those fire exits were shut tight because we know that there were 5 doors and they were all locked with keys. And I suspect they weren't only locked with keys, they were padlocked. They don't say that there, it's kind of sanitized, but they were padlocked. Right? We don't know how the kids were taught in terms of these emergency situations. We don't know how they were taught to respond or react. We don't know whether we'll have to, this is a Ministry of Education building. You'd think that there has to be occupational health and safety standards. We're not only talking about fire safety standards, we're talking about occupational health and safety standards. And I'd love to hear Nicole Cole's perspective, or not only her, but the Rights of the Child Commission. I'd love to hear their perspective because, quite frankly, it's not only indigenous rights we're talking about. We're talking about the rights of children. Some days we have International Day of the Girl. But what we have in this situation is we have the pathologization. We have the pathologization and the criminalization of girls and young women. When people are sort of making this lame, this feeble excuse that these girls were going to, the doors were justifiably padlocked because they were afraid these girls were going to go out at nights to hook up or to drink or to do drugs. It's pathologization. It's stereotyping. It's getting into myths about these girls that whatever happened to them they deserve. Like, who in their right minds, and this is from the officialdom, who in their right minds would even put forward such a proposition in times of such tragedy? It's like you're blaming the victim. You're blaming the victim. The Bowser, even the Bowser, right? The Bowser is the mechanism that the Guyana Fire Service has that carries the water. Right? The Bowser carries the water, and where was the Bowser? The Bowser was in Lethem. In Lethem, trying to spray down the roads and spray down places so that when Orfanali and his crew show up there for independence, for flag raising, they're going to show up today because the flag raising is around midnight. So the flag raising is supposed to be held at Lethem. Hopefully they had a rethink about that and changed that plan in light of the tragedy. I saw that I criticized them the other day. I criticized them because they showed up at a head table. They showed up at a head table in Mahdia, and so I criticized it as very insensitive. And I noticed they paid heed to the criticism. So today, all the commemorative aspects of mourning the kids that died, they formed circles. So if you look at all the pictures from the office of the president, they were in a circle, which is appropriate. In these cases, you meet with people in a circle so that there's no, it's not hierarchical. And so that's what they did this time around. They showed up at the hospital, right? All the government officials showed up at the hospital: the Minister of Education, the President, the Prime Minister, the Commissioner of Police, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and their bodyguards and so on. And you see the children in the hospital, and none of them, absolutely none of them, put on personal protective equipment. And they're bending over, and their faces are in the kids' faces. How do you show up at a hospital where kids are injured and where the possibility of opportunistic infections prevail, and yet you don't wear personal protective equipment? You are not wearing a mask, you're not wearing gowns, you're not wearing head coverings, you're not wearing face coverings. You come in with your dirty shoes from off the street. All these things, they don't want anybody to talk about it, but you have to talk about it. And you can't be concerned. You should be unconcerned about who is offended. And a lot of people are commenting about the protests engaged in in region 8 that people are already asking for compensation. Well, yeah, damages for losses come in the form of money. Like, what do you expect? Do you expect the people that suffered significant losses are gonna just ask you for an apology? Your apology is weak. Your apology is feeble. Your apology doesn't take them anywhere. Compensate them. Compensate them adequately. That's why you have civil litigation. That's why you have litigators. People suffer losses. Losses are compensated by damages. Whether it's in tort law, whether it's in contract law, whether it's in human rights law, in any of those laws, damages come in the form of money. Right? So, I'm the wrong person to talk to tell me that people are already asking for money. What happened there? Yes, and Ishaka says, well, it's an unnecessary loss of life. It is an unnecessary loss of life. And the unfortunate thing in Guyana is that, who you think is going to suffer? The only two people that are going to suffer is the lady, the dorm mother, and the student. And the student that they allege cell phone was seized, and she lit the fire in frustration of her cell phone being taken away. I mean, someone posted a video. A pastor posted a video that they're saying was taken days or a matter of hours before the tragedy, and it showed the children. It showed the children experiencing significant crisis. They were laying on the floor, the pastor was praying, and they were rolling around, and so on and so forth. I don't know, because I live in North America, and you see these behavior manifesting themselves when people consume magic mushroom, or they consume edibles, or they consume some form of psychedelic drug. So I don't know whether someone in that room give them some psychedelic drug that had them behaving in the manner in which they did. But certainly all forms of all protocols in respect to child abuse, all protocols in respect to child abandonment, all protocols in respect to the treatment of children should be explored in this case from a human rights perspective and a criminal perspective. Everything should be looked at to see whether the circumstances before that fire, the circumstances leading up to the fire, and the circumstances that give rise to the fire, and the circumstances that occurred during the fire, all leads to criminal liability, heading all the way to the top. So I think that a whole bunch of questions has to be explored, and I may well get involved in that case. Because, okay, if you're saying the kids were drinking, if you're saying the kids were having underage sex, if you're saying all these sort of things, right? if you're saying all these sort of things, then those children were children who were suffering or at risk of physical harm. They're at risk of sexual exploitation and molestation. They were at risk of emotional harm. And the fire proved that all these sort of harms are present. Where were the expert psychologists? Where were the expert social workers? Where were the Rights of the Child Commission? Where were all these organizations that mandates are to ensure that children are not at risk? I mean, they were not your children, and they weren't children that look at like you. So the lack of care, the lack of concern was not there. But right now in the circumstances, I think you have to have a thorough investigation. And the thorough investigation has to do a deep dive. It has to certainly look at the history of those kids. We call it the histology. So even for autopsies, right, for the dead kids, the first thing you look at when someone dies, especially from a homicide, you look at the history of the person. And so that's what needed to be looked at with respect to the dead children and the children who are alive. Their history relating to abuse, their history relating to physical assaults, to sexual assaults, and other forms of violence, whether in their familial setting or whether it's from strangers or whether it's in the school where they were housed. And you have to determine also, what manifestations there were leading up to the fire. And posting that video, that pastor posting that video certainly provides a manifestation. The interesting thing about, and of course, you want the children to be examined for medical or psychological symptoms. All the children. I mean, the government taking them to the Guyana the day after the event, after they were flown to Georgetown. A lot of people criticize that as insensitive. But some people may say, well, exposing them to other people, exposing them to interaction with others, exposing them to stimuli may have been helpful in terms of the post-traumatic stress that they would be experiencing. The interesting thing about post-traumatic stress and the trauma is that all of us are, as Guyanese, are experiencing trauma. The children of Guyana, particularly the children under 12, they're even experiencing more trauma because it's children. It's a mass wave of children that died. And so the children would center those kids within their own situation, and they'd be worried about themselves and worried about those children that died and remain alive. And so you really need to provide the necessary infrastructural support to children throughout the country. But and interestingly enough, if they said that all these kids, and most of them are under 16, if they said that these kids were leaving and were having sexual interaction with older men who were minors, so the older men were giving them money, and they were hooking up with the older men. So, in other words, it's child P. We can't use the word in here, but it's child P if the children were hooking up with men and having sexual interactions for money. So, they need to have qualified medical experts do physical and genetical examinations of those kids. They need to have written documentation in respect to the kids and medical examinations that were conducted. They need to even do STI testing on the kids. They need to even do HIV exposure assessment. And they need to do mental health assessments of the kids. So in terms of those kids, all 48 of the kids that came out alive from the fire, they need to do a complete rethink, a complete assessment, a complete safety plan for those kids to assess whether they're safe in the communities that they came from, whether they're safe in Mahdia. They need to have follow-up appointments with psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers. The government said, well, we assigned one cabinet minister to each kid so that the government is involved. So the PPP government are control freaks. No doubt about that. They're control freaks. So I don't necessarily agree that a government minister should be handling these kids, because quite frankly what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to silence the kids. So the kids' voices going to get drowned in a red t-shirt, and in terms of throwing crumbs at the kids. So I'm not for that. I think what the PPP government should do is, you just withdraw for the $1.6 billion from the Natural Resource Fund. I think what you want to do is you want to convene, and that's where the opposition and its strengths and its weaknesses come in. There should be a push for an emergency debate in Parliament on the state of the schools in Guyana, the state of residential schools in Guyana, the state of affairs as it relates to students who are from outlying areas who are housed in residential dorms. That's what should happen, and there should be the necessary disbursements from the consolidated fund so that the kids get the necessary help internationally and locally. And I'm saying this, and I'm saying it because I know that the people that matters listen to my live and listen to what I'm saying. So that's what you need to do. You need to convene an emergency debate in Parliament, and you need to have a full and frank discussion about this situation, right? You need to ensure that the necessary nurses, you need to ensure that the necessary sexual assault nurse examiners, you need to ensure that the necessary physicians, you need to explore that the necessary external partners are there. And let's talk about what sexual abuse is. I mean, sexual abuse occurs when a child under the age of 16 is used for sexual purposes by an adult or adolescent, and is inherently emotionally abusive and a betrayal of trust and an abuse of power over the child. And sexual abuse is often, child sexual abuse is often involves exposing a child to any sexual activity or behavior, whether directly or indirectly. And that's prevalent in Guyana. Now, sexual assault is any form of unwanted sexual activity that is forced upon a person without that person's consent. And it could range from unwanted sexual touching to forced intercourse. And both men, women, and children could be susceptible to sexual assault. Child sexual abuse mostly occurs to children under the age of 12, and adolescent sexual abuse is children over the age of 12 and entering puberty or in the early stage of puberty. So you gotta look at the medical and the psychological aspects of these situations. You have to look at that. And it's important that that you collect information about the history of those kids. Very, very important. I'm one of the I'm gonna contact the World Bank. So I'm gonna write to the World Bank. This live reminds me, because I'm one of the experts that the World Bank use every year to evaluate Guyana in terms of the treatment of girls and women. So I'm one of the experts that they use, and they complete a report every year. And so I'm going to contact them because this is an emergency, and so the World Bank should fund a group going into Guyana right now. When that fire occurred, Dexter Todd, who is a forensic lawyer. I'm also a forensic lawyer because I've taken numerous forensic identification courses. And so Dexter Todd raised a whole bunch of issues, and the issues related to y'all should share my life. It's really important. It's a really important life. The issue revolved around the collection and preservation of evidence. Imagine you have a fire, right? Where 19 lives were lost, and people all over, from all over, whether they were government officials or other officials, they were trampling on the scene, right? They were trampling all over the scene. They weren't. None of them. The scene was contaminated. None of them were dressed in the same way as they showed up at the hospital, underdressed, under-equipped. It's the same way they showed up on the scene, right? Contaminated the entire scene by trampling over it just for photo opportunities. That's all y'all did. Y'all showed up there for photo opportunities in the same way y'all showed up there with your dirty shoes and your mouth uncovered where you have children suffering from severe burns. Right? So y'all weren't dressed in forensic suits, and so what happened? Dexter Todd is right. We will lose for valuable forensic evidence this way. You know, they should have had all kind of experts. They showed up with everyone else except the biologists who should be able to take the DNA samples for testing, right? You need a serologist. You would have needed a serologist there so that the proper DNA samples would have been taken, so that you could identify the persons who died and were born beyond recognition. Right? They could be analyzed in respect to their relatives who are alive by taking blood samples or other samples from the relatives that are alive and comparing it to the person who died, and then you get a match. So, for example, in a case like this, they could have reached out to the Center for Forensic Science in Canada. So the Center for Pathology and Laboratory Studies in Toronto, you know, you reach out to a body like that and have them send some experts in, even if you have to pay for it. You know, no expenses should have been spared. You know, you get the DNA of the relatives of the persons who you suspect died. You know, I mean, you do a whole bunch. You have to do a whole bunch of stuff. But what you don't do is you don't contaminate the crime scene as the government did. Contaminated the crime scene by running up on the crime scene in the way they did. Another thing that they could have done is they should have showed a united front with the opposition. So when they were going up to Mahdia, you'd think they would have invited the Home Affairs critic for the opposition, the shadow minister of public health, you know, and those personage, the shadow minister for Indigenous affairs and Amerindian affairs in Guyana. You invite those people up. They took a plane load of diplomats up. You know, taking a plane load of diplomats up doesn't foster unity, doesn't foster oneness of purpose. Taking the opposition up and doing a joint statement with the opposition would have fostered oneness of purpose, and that would have been important because you want to instill a sense of calm, you want to instill a sense of confidence, right? And that's not what is happening. That's not what is happening in Guyana. That's not what is happening in Guyana at all. You know, instead they say, well, don't politicize this. Well, of course it's politicized. It's politicized from the beginning. and your actions as a government politicize the situation. Because it's not all hands on deck. I mean, you'd think, okay, all of you flew in, right? All of you flew in on private planes and government planes and helicopters, right? But you haven't made yourself available for a press conference, right? The media, the fifth estate should be able to ask certain questions, right? You should make yourself available to the media to answer questions. But no, none of you have made yourself available to the media to answer questions. Where's the accountability? Where is the accountability? Where is the transparency? There's none. Absolutely none. And then what do? You punish the media. You punish media practitioners that want to ask certain questions. Right? How is that acceptable? How does that foster democracy? All it does is it shows the control freakism. That this government think will work. It doesn't work in 2023. It doesn't even work in the Soviet Union or Russia. It doesn't even work in Russia because the Russians now are coming out on the streets. They're finding ways to protest. And Dennis Gibral wrote this. One of the journalists, he's the editor for Memoir Waves. He says Guyana experienced one of its most serious tragedies, but all we got was one-way communication from the authorities. Why do you think that is acceptable? It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable, and all you're doing is planting. You plant certain information, with newsroom, or with NCN, right? That doesn't work. It doesn't instill confidence. It doesn't instill confidence that you're transparent and that you're accountable. It shows that you have something to hide. So the entire optics by the PPP government has been quite poor in terms of managing this crisis. And I can say so because I'm not trying to get a contract from the PPP. I'm not trying to have a begging bowl trying to beg the PPP for anything. So I can state my opinion and state it as it is. I can state the facts as it is, or at least from the perspective I see it. The tragedy in Mahdia, it really raised some significant issues. It raised systemic issues in terms of how our Indigenous, our Aboriginal, our First Nations, our Amerindian people are treated. And Ravi Singh, you're right. Facts is what matter. And what we have here is we have the hiding of facts. We have facts being ducked, and we have obfuscation, and we have conduct that doesn't instill confidence that the safety of our Amerindians, the safety of indigenous communities matters. I mean, for too long, Aboriginal, Amerindians, indigenous persons have suffered significant exploitations in terms of their lands, in terms of their resources, in terms of their personage. Right? And then they try to shut down people like Michael McGarrell, or they try to shut down people like the opposition indigenous critic Marvin Williams, who's indigenous. They try to shut them down. Right, but I prefer to listen to them because they have got their boots on the ground, and they know experientially what the experiences of Aboriginal and indigenous persons are. So I rather listen to them than listen to some spokesperson. And I mean, I'll say this. When I criticize the PPP, I also criticize the APNU AFC. I always say this, and I mean it. The AFC, APNU AFC, the PNC, and the PPP, they've all failed Guyana. All of them have failed Guyana. They're birds of a feather. I mean, look at Anand Nandalal. Anand Nandalal behavior parallels Basil Williams. Both of them are birds of a feather. Their behavior parallel each other in terms of how they behave as attorney generals. President Ali is a Burnham reincarnate. Burnham used to have public servants. Going in droves. Going up to Hope Estate, cleaning canals, cleaning drains, and doing all that sort of stuff. That's what Orphan Ali has. He has the commissioner of police, the chief of staff of the army. He has all the police trainees. He has the army recruits and other officers. They're all cleaning up the city, cleaning up garbage. Right? Imagine that you have the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. You have the chief of staff of the defense forces. You have the commissioner of police. You have other heads of the joint services cleaning up the seawalls. When you have one of the most dangerous criminals in Guyana, Royden Williams, called Smalley, on the loose. And I said this in a tongue-in-cheek way, that Smalley was probably at the Marriott Hotel watching them and laughing. But the point was that you don't have, and that was before the fire, of course, you don't have a mass murderer breaking out of a prison on with gunfire, with heavy gunfire, and you have your joint services cleaning up the seawalls. It was the wrong optics. It sent the wrong message. It sent the wrong message that security wasn't taken seriously at all. And so these are things that one needs to ventilate, one needs to talk about, and like I said, all the stuff that happened in Guyana over the past 2 weeks, it's draining, it's emotionally draining, it's heavy. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a massive crisis of depression and suicide. Guyana is one of the highest rates, has one of the highest rates of suicide in the world, and I wouldn't be surprised if everything that's happening in the 2 weeks push a lot of people over the edge. I mean, we have to get our act together. I'm not attending any independence commemorative ceremonies this year. They have a whole bunch of stuff happening in Toronto. I'm not attending any of it. I'm not attending any of it, and I agree that the line minister should be resigned or retired or reassigned. The Minister of Education, Priya Manikchan, the Minister of Local Government, Mr. Dharamlal, and the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Ms. Sukai. They should all be reassigned. I mean, the tragedy that happened in Mahdia, people have to take responsibilities, and responsibility lies with the political directorate all the way to the top. Maybe there should even be a confidence vote in Parliament. Maybe there should be a confidence vote in Parliament as well. But fundamentally, I'm going to tell you all this. It's important to speak about these issues. It's important to speak fearlessly. It's important to speak about them without favor, without ill will, right? Without malice. But it's important to speak about them. Prosecuting the teenage girl who allegedly set the fire, prosecuting the dorm mother, that doesn't end the story. That doesn't end the significant questions that are raised in terms of how these children were housed, how these children were treated. It doesn't end the inquiries that should be conducted, especially whereas here, those children were subjected to child abuse. Those children were subject to neglect. Those children were not adequately monitored by child welfare agencies in Guyana. Those children were not properly supervised by their caregivers. And all that, and the government the government was complicit. Like they said, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs or Aboriginal Affairs went there every weekend. She was in Region 8. How could she not see or observe that the dormitory that housed those schoolgirls was akin to a maximum security prison? How could she not see that? And you know, if she saw that, how could she not take action by sending in the necessary experts to evaluate that system to ensure that the children were safe? You know, Guyana is a small society, and word gets around. Word gets around. So right now, the government really needs to spend money. They really need to have medical assessment of those children, go through their history, physical examinations, ensure their health records are up to date, conduct mental health screening, conduct psychological assessments for the kids. You know, they need to do developmental assessments for the kids to make sure that their growth and development are age proportionate. They need to really provide mental and psychological help for the kids. They need to provide support for the caregivers that are responsible for those kids. Because you've got a dorm mother and a dorm father, two people supervising 60 kids. And the supervision is 24/7, 365. How does that make sense? Square that up for me. Make that make sense. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense at all. You know, another question would have arisen, right? Because they don't want to use their heads, right? They want to send out a subpar report like the fire department did, and we must just eat it up. We must just accept that. Let me ask you this. Think about this. What was the circle of care, right? What was the circle of care that was in place at the compound, at the school? So there was a female dormitory and there was a male dormitory, right? So the female dormitory housed the female students, the male dormitory housed the male students, right? You would think that you would have coordination. And the coordination that you would have in place is you'd have child welfare agencies involved, because of course we're hearing that the children were subject to sexual and other forms of abuse and alcohol and drug use, right? So you'd have child welfare agencies involved, you'd have the police involved, you'd have caregivers involved, you'd have the parents involved, you'd have the staff at the school involved, you'd have mental health providers involved, you'd have lawyers from the legal aid clinic involved, or from the Rights of the Child agency involved, and you'd have the Ministry of Education involved and the Ministry of Health. So you call that a circle of care, and you'd meet and you'd have a coordinated approach in terms of how to ensure that the kids get the right support systems while they're at the school, given the sort of manifestations that are out there and that you should have known or ought to have known. And then you document it. So it would be interesting to really have an inquiry, a full an impartial inquiry into the situation that occurred there, and so that everything comes out into the open, and we look at whether there was the leadership or the lack thereof in terms of how those kids were managed, the organizational structure, whether there was an organizational structure in place or any structure at all, whether there were clinical services available to the kids, what sort of referral sources were involved or available for children in crisis, what sort of medical support were there for the children who would have experienced either physical or sexual abuse, right? So there's lots of what sort of psychosocial services were available to those children who would have experienced either trauma or psychological illnesses. And the young Mr. Martin, who I held as a baby, and he's now 37 years old. Happy belated birthday. He asked a question. Well, who gave the dorm mother the order to lock up the place like that at night? Who gave that order need to face the court too? Not just that woman and child. And it's true. So I thought about it, and the charge that could be laid is criminal negligence causing death. So in a civil lawsuit, you have contributory negligence, right? In the criminal justice system, you have criminal negligence causing death. So if you neglected to do something that is your duty to do, you could be charged with criminal negligence causing death. And the fire department officials who should have conducted inspections during the day and at night to ensure that place was safe, they could be subject to criminal charges. The child welfare officers could be subject to criminal charges. The Ministry of Education officials in the region could be subjected to criminal charges. The officials responsible for that home could be subject to criminal charges.